Good evening, Demon fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and the old Melbourne was back with a vengeance this week, and people wonder why D's fans have trust issues. If you had told me in the pre-season that we'd be 11-2 going into the bye, I'd have said you're crazy, but I'd be wrapped with that. So why do I feel so uneasy? Hopefully my co-host can put me at ease tonight and tell me that everything is going to be all right. Joining me tonight is longtime Demonlander George. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Andy. I don't know if I can do that job. I'm hoping there's a doctor in the house who can call in later on during the podcast, because we certainly need a remedy for Andy's MFCSS.
Yeah, I think I really do need some therapy. We might need to have a regular segment on this show, and I'm sure there's lots of doctors that are, and in particular psychiatrists that are Demon supporters, you'd have to think.
There should be plenty out there, but nobody's been able to present something for us so far. We need a vaccine, if that's the truth.
We do. Well, here you can put one in my arm. Also joining us tonight, Bim Man. Good evening, Bim Man.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, George, and good evening, Demonlanders. And as a science fiction fan and currently watching Loki on Disney, and the idea of multiverses and different timelines, I felt like I'd sort of fallen back into a 2019 timeline there, and then I jumped on Demonland, and up pops the "Is Goodwin the right man?" Thread back from the dead.
That thread's always bound to rear its ugly head every time we lose, so that's a given.
Yeah, so back on the wrong timeline, and I woke up in the middle of 2019 with none of the excuses of 2019 of injury, but maybe it was the loss we had to have.
When talking about multiverses, I'm very jealous of my evil counterpart somewhere that's probably enjoying, multiple premierships throughout his life. So it's bugging.
Well, it shouldn't be, because now he's about to enter a long period of drought and no premierships at all. So now's your time.
Well, I'd take his life over mine at the moment. All right, let's get into this, boys. It was a disappointing showing from start to finish, and even when we strung multiple goals together in the third quarter, I still didn't feel like we were the better team, and certainly never felt like we were going to run away with it. The Pies seemed like they were in control for almost the entire match. They were able to chip it around and maintain possession and control, and we simply weren't applying any pressure at contests. We really could have matched their intensity. And I don't know if they were just doing it for bucks or if we were just truly off our game, or maybe it's a combination of both. But nothing we did yesterday resembled our impressive start to the season. I thought we were very slow, we were fumbly, and we were second to the contest, which probably contributed to us how unstructured we seemed to be. George, am I wrong there?
No, you've hit the nail pretty well on the head. I think from that perspective, the lack of pressure was evident right from the very start, it's rather a glib term when you talk about it, lack of pressure, but it's just actually doing the hard work, and right around the ground, across every line, there was just insufficient pressure on the opposition to force turnovers. There was insufficient pressure on them that gave them free run with the ball. Unfortunately, we fell into the old rope-a-dope trick again. It was the same trick that was used against us by Hawthorn, by Geelong, by Adelaide, and we let it run for simply too long. The outcome of that is, when they're just playing this kick and chip and kick, is that you spend an awful lot of time running around getting absolutely nothing of benefit for your own efforts. But they had 125 uncontested marks, but also that means you can't tackle them. And so at the end of the game, we only had 44 tackles for the whole game. So that's one of the reasons why the pressure game wasn't evident. we just fell into that trap yet again. And like I said, this has been done a couple of times to us. We've overcome it in the past by changing our approach. We didn't do it in this game. The other thing I think that was evident was possibly something to do with the size of the ground. The SCG is not dramatically different from the MCG these days. It's only about 5 metres shorter, but what that means is that if you get a kick out of the middle at the SCG, you're basically kicking for goal with the next kick. So a quick kick out of the middle becomes far more advantageous to the attacking side than what it does at the MCG. The MCG, you're sort of sitting at or around 50, whereas at the SCG, you finish up sort of that bit further inside within kicking distance. And time again, we saw the ball land in that short area somewhere between the 35 and the 50 metre mark with players unmarked. That was really frustrating for us. So the defence fell apart. We can talk a little bit more about that perhaps later on. The other thing is that we've built a defence around structured layers. And when the ball comes in that quickly, you can't build the layer up in front of the attacking side. So it was really a failure all round to adapt to the circumstances that the opposition were throwing at us.
Big man.
Yeah, I think that there's no real mystery about the game, and I think the stat that jumped out for me that I saw after the game was they had 53 tackles to our 43. And we're number one tackle side in the league. We're number one contest side in the league. And they had 16 tackles inside their 50 to our 6. That's, almost 3 times as many. And, that's the game. The other interesting stat, Grind Time on Demonlands pointed this out previously. I think it was after the Adelaide game. That our average running speed in attack was higher than our average running speed in defence. And the only 2 times that's happened this season was the Pies game and the Crows game, both losses, of course. And I think you quite rightly suggest that that's evidence of a lack of defensive spread and run. Again, as we've talked about, it's really hard to see the running and how much running is not being done or is being done, when you're watching on television. But it's hard to see the absence of something, but you can see the effect of it. And the effect of it was, the inside 50s, those kicks. That's a really good point about how short that is. It negates our strength a little bit, even though it's narrow, so that should help our zone harder to get through. It's easier to get through because, it's less distance to get through, if that makes sense. So it makes quite a big difference. But, they out-tackled us out, inside 50, 16 to 6 is a bad number for us. None of the very opposite to last week in the second half that George talked about. Our game plan just wasn't there. We weren't spreading, we weren't running. That's sort of their use of the corridor that people talk about. Adelaide did the same thing, and I could jump into the television if I could and just I cannot stand Brian Taylor anymore. I think I've hit my limit. I've got to get back to watching footy live at the G because, I don't know, he was carrying on at the end of that game and asking questions like, what does this mean for Melbourne? And, have the teams worked them out? And, it's just ridiculous because the reason they were able to use the corridor, the same as Adelaide, was because we weren't spreading, we weren't blocking the corridor. And it was interesting. I don't know, I think it was Lever or perhaps it was Brayshaw, but they seem to have increased the mics on the umpire, maybe to offset the lack of crowd noise at some of these games. And one of them was clearly yelling out more talk in that last quarter. And it just spoke to me of a team that was flat and we played flat. I said just before we came on, I was much more frustrated with the Adelaide loss because, we were in that game, we were a bit off, but we were never in this game. And if we'd snuck a win at the end, which, with a bit of balance we wouldn't have deserved it. They deserved to win. They cracked it harder all game. And, we went backwards a little bit and, that multiverse back to some of our efforts in 2019, a few of our efforts in 2020 where we weren't spreading, we weren't running. But, we were tackling, and that we broke even the contested ball. We're 6-7 plus in contested ball, so number one in the league in contested ball. So all of our metrics were way off. So I'm to be honest, I'm not too fussed about the loss.
If you'd like to join us tonight and discuss any of the topics we're talking about, 0390163666. That's 0390163666. Give us a call on Skype, Demonland31, or join us in the chat room, demonland.com/podcast. Well, did our defence fail, or was the ball just allowed to come in too easily? Most of Collingwood's goals came from uncontested marks inside their forward 50. I believe the count at the end of the match was 18, and that's not just uncontested, that's just marks in total in their inside 50. So did our usually miserly defence fail, or was the ball just coming in too quickly for us to set up our defensive structure? We usually apply such good pressure around the ground to allow time for the back line to set up, but the Pies were just moving the ball too quickly for us. They were constantly playing on. I felt that we just weren't able to counter this, and I don't want to sound like Brian Taylor, their bin man, but have we provided teams with a blueprint to penetrate this defence? And look, I get his comment about us. Where to now from one loss is pretty silly, but I don't know. We've had two teams sort of expose us, sort of down the corridor.
I reckon they might have found a blueprint. What I'd take from it is to sneak some hash into their pre-game food, because it was really down to our lack of pressure that allowed that corridor, that quick movement. We're playing in our normal way. They're not getting that kick off. Like, there was so much made of those short kicks, and is this something that, take out, leave it, a kick it high? Sure, no worries. Try doing that in the heat of finals. That's what the Dogs tried to do. That's the Dogs game, those short little drilling kicks that the Dogs love. They could not get one off against us. We completely shut that down. They love to use the corridor, the Dogs. I mean, they're the best team, the best defensive team in the league by a long, long way, the Western Bulldogs, and they could not get the ball into the corridor. We completely stopped that drilling kick. So, the blueprint is to find a way to slow Melbourne down so that we're not doing the work that we need to do. And any team will beat us. I've said that a number of times this season is, I made the mistake of predicting a 50-point win. But that was fully predicated on us bringing the heat, bringing the full pressure. And if we did, we would have beat that, by 50. They've got a good defence, that I have to say, and they've got a good system. So no, I don't think there's a blueprint. That corridor won't teams won't be able to find their corridor. We've proven that, haven't we? We've played some of the best teams in the AFL in terms of ball movement, and we've completely taken that away from them. So, I just think that if we played, brilliant football and with full intensity, then sure, maybe that you could argue that teams have worked us out. But, we so clearly and evidently didn't. You could tell from 5 minutes that we'd come out a bit flat. The funny thing was that we got up in the third quarter. We missed some chances. That's the thing. We, again, missed easy shots. Tom McDonald, we could have got out to a 3-4 goal lead fairly quickly in that quarter, and then who knows, we might have been able to hold on. But, again, it would have been a steal.
They also got a goal from a mark that clearly was not a mark, with May having first purchase on that as well. So...
Yeah, and look, I think that it's easy to think about the defence, about, where they worked out. Really, the problem was the stat that I said before, 6 inside 50 stats. And I know we'll talk about Sam Wiedemann later, but we had just terrible inside 50 pressure. We weren't trapping the ball in. We were allowing them to take intercept marks. And that's what Goodwin pointed out in his presser, is that then they just bounced off half-back flank. And that's the point. That's what we do to teams normally. If we intercept, bounce off half-back, it then is very hard to stop a team in transition after that. And particularly, the only way to do so is to run back hard and get your numbers back. And if you're not doing that, then you'll get one-on-ones inside 50. That's what they got.
Let's talk about rucks and clearances. Max Gawn, I thought, was comprehensively beaten in the ruck, and it wasn't until after half-time that Max was able to start taking marks around the ground. I thought Luke Jackson performed so much better in the middle. He once again provides that extra midfielder once the ball hits the deck. It was possibly Luke's best game for the club. He's ended the match with 21 possessions, 8 contested, 7 marks and the 2 goals, and I believe he's picked up 2 coaches' votes in a game where coaches' votes for Melbourne players weren't going to be thrown around. Clearances, well beaten in the ruck and the clearances. Pies still have some quality in their midfield, and they all stood up. I thought some of our mids who often try to do too much and don't always take the first option. And, you know, having said that, I think we desperately need Viney back in the team for a bit of grunt, even though he's been accused at times of trying to do too much and not taking the first option. Petrarca, despite some cameos, wasn't nearly half his best. Oliver was well held. He was being roughed up. He copped it quite a few times. I thought Sparrow seemed a bit out of his depth. George, how'd you see our midfield and in particular?
Yeah, we'll start with Max, I think, and that's the Max's worst performance I've seen for a couple of years now. He was comprehensively beaten by a 20-year-old second-rate ruckman for Collingwood. You know, it wasn't against Grundy. He managed to turn it back on in the third quarter, and thank goodness he did. Because he just wasn't providing anything either in the middle or around the ground, and that's Max's big ace in the pack is his ability to mark around the ground and provide that extra drive. So I don't know what's gone on there. Let's just hope that he's needs that rest from the first half of the season. He certainly hasn't been playing his best football in the last couple of weeks, so we just have to keep the fingers crossed that he's not hiding something else there. Jackson was fantastic in contrast. 21 possessions for a 20-year-old ruckman, multiple hit-outs and the extra drive that he provides. And then he was also taking marks around the ground and up the forward line in contrast to a lot of others. He was a real big positive out of that game for us, and it's really hard to remember that he is only 20 years old and playing in a ruck role. So it's a big future for us in that aspect. The rest of the mids were, and we talked about defence, and Binman's talked extensively about defence before. Defence isn't just about the 6 people sitting in the back line. Defence for this team is across the whole ground, and whether like Binman said, we don't know. You can't judge on TV who's not filling that hole that was so obviously apparent in this game. Was it the wingers not getting back? Was it the mids not getting back? But certainly the mids didn't seem to be doing their job as well as they should. Sparrow had a bit of a horror game, but given that it's only his second game, I think, from coming second actual game in a long, long time, he had a whole stack of errors that probably was an indication that you're playing AFL footy now and not VFL things that you can get away. But he'll learn from all that. I was unimpressed with Harms. Supposedly he was put onto De Goey and certainly didn't slow De Goey down in any way, shape or form. I think Harmsy unfortunately has to be given specific instructions right from the very start about how to attack or tag someone like he did so well against Libba. But he certainly didn't stop the drive coming out of the middle, and unfortunately his turnovers and fumbling were costing us dearly in the middle. So the midfield was well down on what they should have been, and that was one of the reasons perhaps why the defensive holes were so apparent.
One of the interesting things is, as you say, you can't really see who's not doing the running, but you can see the upshot of it. And one of the things that Goody noted, and you picked up on before, Andy, was they're chipping it around and they're moving it. They had, just looking at their kicks, they had 34 more kicks than us, and that with those chipping and holding. When we're on, we're pressing right up on them and we're making those kicks really difficult. And they're not they're struggling to switch the ball with any confidence. As I say, the good example was the way we did that to the Dogs and last week in the Lions in the second half. His teams, struggled to switch it, but they were switching it with ease because we weren't pressing up on them. So you can't see who wasn't pressing up on them, but you can certainly see all those uncontested marks are a function of those sideways kicks that ordinarily we're just not allowing them. And, we're in fact daring them to take that kick on because at some point they'll make a mistake and turn it over. And, some of the stats were quite, for a game that we only lost by, a couple of goals, well, 3 in the end, wasn't it? They won almost everything. They won hit-outs 33-26, and I was thinking, when was last time gone? Well, I guess he wasn't rucking the whole game, but, as George notes, he's a young ruckman to win the hit-outs, smashed us in clearances. I've got nothing, and it's not a good week for, pumping up the clearances, both around the ground and the centre clearances. They have more possessions, just one more contested possession, but that's that midfield. You'd hope that we'd have a good advantage in our midfield. And 35, 34 more uncontested possessions. And again, that's that chipping around. And I think Jordan, I think one of the things that'd be interesting to, we've got a lot of young players in that team, and it felt like they were, they're running on fumes a little bit, which is understandable. Jordan has been manful this year in terms of he hasn't missed a game. Cozzy looked flat, and they're right across the ground. They look, and even Langdon looked a bit flat. So that sort of idea of you mids pushing back, it wasn't really clear that was happening. And Langdon's our best runner, wasn't. If you think about, Brayshaw wasn't deep in our back line as often as he has been at times. So the mid did struggle, and I totally agree that Viney is going to be a super important player to come back in after the break.
It seemed like we weren't playing Langdon's side of the ground. We were going up the side closest to the cameras the whole time. That's the side Brayshaw was on. It seemed like we weren't using Langdon as much, and I don't know if there's anything in that, but
I can't be sure, Andy. I think they at halftime. I think they tried to swap sides with Brayshaw and Langdon, but I think it was all part of what Collingwood was doing. They knew which side of the ground not to attack.
Yeah.
They certainly did their homework on us. Just back to another point that Binman made, Jordan was just fantastic in this game. There were only 2 players on the ground who made no errors. One was Stephen May, and the other was James Jordan. For a 20-year-old, that's a fantastic outcome in a game where plenty of other senior players in the side were making multiple errors, which were very costly. So to have someone with that quality of use of ball for the whole game was just a great positive for us.
Probably evidence, though, of him sort of probably running out of gas a little bit in terms of the point in the season, and I think he only had 56% or something like that of game time. So, for a player who was as influential as he was in a team that was struggling generally, particularly in the midfield, they're obviously, it seems like, nursing him because I think he played mid-80s last week. So, he might be running out of gas. And, Goody said as much, didn't he, that, it was an unusually honest sort of answer from Goody, who normally sort of gives a non-answer to those questions. But, about the break's probably coming at a good time. And I think it's also worth, noting that they've been away for a couple of weeks. I know that other teams have, and, that they've been so they've had to travel 2 weeks in a row, and this game is supposed to be in Melbourne. And it's, I think that that these sorts of results on either side of the bye are really common. If you go back since the byes first started happening, it's a really common phenomenon. And of course, people point out how often Geelong lose after the bye. And there was a interesting sort of idea that was floated on Demonland, I forget the poster, but the idea of that clubs look to do your training load in the middle of the season around the bye, because it's the only time you can get really solid clicks into the players' legs. And so, that not looking for excuses, but, I wonder whether they have done that with a view to giving them a bit of a freshen up and then getting some good Ks into their legs sort of to get ready for the second half of the season. the idea that Geelong have done that historically, which might be a factor in the way they come back after their bye, and that Richmond have historically done that as well. Look to use that bye period as the time to really put sort of kilometres in their legs. And if you look at the Richmond West Coast game, which was a ripper game, and I really enjoyed watching Richmond lose, but they ran out of gas as well in that last quarter, Richmond, and I thought we did too. It was funny. We had the best of that third quarter, but we came out, and when they not long into it, it appeared to me that we weren't going to win that. We looked gassed, and that's the first time I've seen us look gassed in the last quarter. So, perhaps there's something in that, and but definitely again, people think about Collingwood. We struggled to beat them, but we were a younger team than they had out in the field. So I think that's worth noting. And in terms of unusual results, just the previous day, Sydney got rolled by Hawks, who are in a much worse sort of shape than the Pies. And Sydney, pushing for a top 4. There was a lot riding on that game for Sydney. These sorts of results are really not uncommon at this stage of the season around the bye week.
It's a real shame that there's no seconds competition running at the moment, because it'd be be good to be able to play some of the younger guys, give them a break in that way, bring in some players, but we just don't have that ability at the moment. Like I don't know when the twos are going to start back up, if they are going to in the coming weeks, but a guy like Sparrow. Be good to get him a few games, 4 quarters in, in the twos. Let's talk.
That's sort of a bit what I was meaning last week, though, about that. I reckon they missed a trick. That this is a good time for the exact reason that I was saying. People are flat. They're looking forward to the break. Maybe their mind's already sort of jumping ahead. I just don't think we were drinking our own bathwater or anything like that. I just genuinely think that in AFL footy, it's not like the 90s where a Hawks wouldn't get rolled. Their greatest skill would win the day. Our system, as we've talked about, is all dependent on all team effort. And if that's off just a few percent, you'll lose. And it was off 10%. I reckon that it would have been, worth bringing in fresh young players, the Bakers and the Chandlers, and and giving them a run and getting some energy into that team. For that reason, I reckon that we lack spark, and it would have been good to have some of those players who are on the edge, on the fringe, get them into the team and get them up and running.
We did have a 10-day break, but that possibly could have worked against us.
Particularly if we're loading up on our training.
Let's talk forward line and forward entries. Our entries into the forward line were very concerning. A familiar staple of the last couple of years was winning the inside 50 count, but still losing the match. And yesterday was no different. We won the inside 50 count, 54-47, but the entries were certainly not fruitful. That's a +7 for inside 50s, but a -7 for scoring shots. A lot of entries went wide to the pocket, as we're accustomed to do, and the rest went down the throats of the opposition defenders or out on the full, as I saw Gus do a couple times, and even Petrarca. His kicking was very off a few times. Bailey Fritsch was our only, I think you said it, George, in your match report, he was our only permanent forward that produced any goals. Tom McDonald failed to kick straight. He also, in general play, just simply didn't seem like he was on his game. And then that brings us to Sam Wiedemann. The last few weeks we've been questioning Sam's position in the team, and if I wasn't convinced Sam won't cut it at AFL level before yesterday's game, then I'm certainly am now. But where to from here? Is Ben Brown the answer? I believe we need to try him and give him at least as much time as they've given Wiedemann. But what is worrying is that this week, with T-Mac potentially being laid out due to the upcoming birth of his child, Ben Brown was overlooked and the gig would have been given to Mitch Brown. And I like Mitch, and I believe that he's an adequate top-up, but he's an adequate top-up in case of emergency break glass scenario when you've got forwards going down left, right and centre, you bring in Mitch Brown. So where's Ben Brown fit into all this? And George, I might start with you. You can start talking about Sam first, and then we can talk about where we go from here in terms of our forward line.
I think Sam's written his "Don't Come Monday" card quite substantially. That was for someone who was obviously put into the side to show your wares over the previous 5 weeks or 5 games. He completely and utterly failed. For a full forward of any nature to come into an AFL game and finish up with 0 kicks and 0 marks is just simply incomprehensible. We've talked about previously the lack of second efforts in Sam, and that's always been my big hit on him. But in this game, it was even worse. I don't think he actually knows how to lead. He was starting behind Roughhead, and when York, I remember one play in particular in the last quarter, Petrarca had the ball about 60 metres out, was looking for someone to kick it to, and Wiedemann sitting behind Roughhead in the goal square. If it was a Josh Kennedy, he'd be sprinting straight out to the middle of the 50-metre arc to create an option. And even if he doesn't get the ball, it opens up space behind him. He drags Roughhead away from the goal square. I don't know what he's been doing for the last 5 years in terms of training, but that was a full forward who doesn't know how to play full forward. Very sad. And that's why it's going to be so easy to put Brown in of either nature in the next game. At least both of them know what to do. But that's enough for Sam. Like I said, I think he's written his own card for the coming games. The particular thing that annoyed the hell out of me during the game was I think they had 12 intercept marks inside the 50. That was critical, and perhaps there was a nature for the mids. I think it might have been the nature of this short ground again, only fractionally, that if they get the break further up the ground at Sydney, you're within range really quickly. So here was the opportunity just to lay the ball into the forward line. It was very I was very much like Melbourne of past years. They'll bang it into the forward line, see what happens. Style of play, but it just wasn't working when you've got people who aren't providing targets up forward. T-Mac was obviously off his best. It's just astounding that he missed those set shots in particular. It's been mad said if he'd managed to nail a couple of those, we might have been able to snatch the game from the jaws of defeat. But yeah, the forward line was completely dysfunctional. And I think the coaches have only got 1 and maybe 2 options for the next time we come up against them.
Yeah, not much more I can add except for I totally agree, and that's what he had negative 3 metres gain, minus 3 metres gain for a full forward. It's like I saw that stat and thought maybe that's the heart of the problem. He's going the wrong way. Like the goals are that way, big fella. But it's really, for me, it's his sort of lack of intensity. That's the thing that I worry about. I'm curious as whether maybe that's a function. Maybe it's a manifestation of stress for him, or when he's fearing failure, or he's struggling to perform. The way it manifests is his lack of intensity, because as opposed to not wanting to, if that makes sense. And I wonder whether if they can find a way to get him more aroused or sort of intense when he plays, that his marking will improve. And really, there was one play where he impacted a marking contest and we got a goal from it, and it stood out by it was stood out because it was the only one he did, basically. But for me, the example of his lack of intensity that I think is a problem for him, it's a big problem for us, is that with about, I think, maybe 90 seconds to go, we're 2 goals down. So, in reality, we're very, very unlikely to win. A slim chance, a chance nonetheless. And he, and I forget the Collingwood player, but he was manning the mark from after a mark or free kick on the Pies play. It was deep in our forward line in the pocket, but only 10, 15 minutes from goal. And the Pies player, of course, held the ball as long as possible, as you would, to run down the clock. Umpire called play on. And, he should have been totally wired, and as soon as he heard play on, just sprinting towards the Collingwood player to put him under pressure, because our only hope of winning that game was that either a tackle or something, or that next kick got dump kicked straight to us and we scored from that play. That was the only chance we had of winning. But he just sort of lumbered after him, and again, I can't remember the Pies player. The Pies player was able to hold it for a while after it had been called play on, then move forward into space and kick it, down the line, and that was that. The game was over, and it just struck me as remarkable in the circumstances. Technically we were unlikely to win. We had to score 2 goals, but surely in that moment you're just completely wired about doing whatever you can. Even putting a late hit on him wouldn't have mattered. Giving away a free kick wouldn't have mattered at that point. But he just doesn't seem to show that intensity, and you wonder whether that's something that he can find a way to unlock it, because I just think that it's too early to say that he's not going to make it. But he honestly, after that performance, they need to bring Ben Brown back into the side. They're obviously committed to the tour, and again, there was the discussion about potentially they're looking to get Ben Brown stronger through the core, get him fit, a bit concerned about his fitness, give him a solid block with a view to bring him, give Weed his chance, and which they've done. And I think he hasn't taken that. He clearly hasn't taken that, and then bring Brown back in fit after the bye.
What do you think, Andy?
I think Ben Brown has to come in. My big worry is that he wasn't even considered to come in this week. And Bimman, where are you basing this? I heard someone else say it to me, a non-Demon Land person mentioned something about that, but didn't know where he'd heard it from. Where are you getting this? They're building up Ben Brown. Is that from anywhere in particular?
It's from Demonland. I forget the poster, but they suggested that there was that there was word from in the club that they weren't happy with how fit he was or otherwise, or and that they were looking to get him fitter and put a good sort of period of strength, like a mini pre-season, like the one that OMAC did, with a view to bringing him back in for the back half of the season, fit and raring to go.
Well, that worked out really well for OMAC.
Well, he came back. He came back and he had a good period there. Actually, it did work out pretty well.
No, I'm talking about where he is now.
Not long term, but look, let's not. But I was wondering about how long it would take for. It's like the that sort of degree of separation when someone always comes back to
6 degrees. 6
degrees. Well, someone always comes back to OMAC. Leave the poor boy alone.
You brought him up. I didn't mention him. In terms of our entries into forward, the non just bombing it in, we do, and we've talked about this before, we do go very wide into the pockets, and you've discussed why they do that in terms of lowering the percentages of where the ball can go from there. But I'd like us to mix it up a bit. And you mentioned Wiedemann should be leading straight down the line, but that's obviously not our tactic. We go to the and often two players will lead into that area, whether it's T-Mac and Fritsch, and they end up spoiling each other, or I don't know. It's just
Sorry, George.
It'll be interesting though when Brown does come in, because his style of leading is basically straight ahead and up the ground. So it'll be interesting to see how the mids in particular and the people bringing the ball in react to something like that. If you've got someone like Wiedemann who hasn't marked the ball basically in the last 5 or 6 weeks, you've got to look for other options up there. We've been able to get the ball into the pockets, and that's a good percentage kick. Fritsch has been able to mark it, so Fritsch has been a very good option in that. But kicking the ball basically to the top of the goal square hasn't been a good option with what we've got. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next game if Brown is at the full forward position.
And that will be at the G. And I think, George, it's a really good point that I hadn't really sort of considered about the size of the SCG, is that mucks around with our game plan in a number of ways. Firstly, as you noted about the way that we set up the rings of defence, so they're less effectual and a smaller, narrower ground. But that predictability of kicking to the pockets, that's what we do at the G, but there's so much more space to run into. So, you are getting rich space on marking on the boundary line side. But it's that, it's predicated on bringing the ball to ground at every single contest. And as George pointed out before, they had 12 intercept marks in their back half. So, it starts to not work. But also when you do get it to ground, you need, your players like Cozzy to be performing, and we didn't. We only had 6 tackles inside 50. So we just couldn't keep it in there. We couldn't, one of our major strengths is trapping it. We're the best team in the AFL in trapping it in our forward half, and we were terrible at that because the ball was just going out. But, I think that narrowness of the SCG up in those pockets, it basically isn't a pocket. When you look at them take a shot from the boundary line, it's so straight on that, they don't even need to worry about going for a banana. It's so narrow. So I think that the ground doesn't suit us. It's funny that we chose it, that ground. That was obviously a commercial decision. But, it's definitely didn't suit us. I think it took away a lot of our strengths, not least of which George's point about how quickly a kick from, say, the wing can get inside 50. So, again, that takes away our ability to use Lever and May and Petty as intercept marking to a degree, because there's very little opportunity for them to run intercept into space. Everywhere across that back line, even when they're not flooding back, is crowded. So it's harder to get defensive marks, although they found it easier than us.
Well, it's easy when you kick it straight to them as well.
Yeah, that's true. And there was some shocking turnovers. I mean, our kicking was just appalling, and, track was appalling, and there was a few some of the flashes from the past as well were there, weren't they? Some Hollywood hand passes, some sort of half efforts. I thought that Cozzy played like a player who looked like he really needs a rest. And there were a couple of examples of players burning each other, which was interesting because, in a way, the whole game for me was the exception that proved the rule. And Cozzy burnt someone. T-Mac burnt Wiedemann really badly at one stage. And, both of those examples jumped out at me because I think Cozzy burnt Fritter. And both of those examples jumped out because how rare they are this year. So some of our bad habits came back, and it's probably not a bad thing to go into the bye with that fresh in the mind about, well, look, this is what happens if you don't bring your complete effort and your selflessness. You will lose to any team in the AFL.
I think Track also burnt T-Mac. He ended up kicking the goal when he kicked that check side, a banana.
Yeah, he did. He
could have easily handballed it over into the goal square. Yeah. Terence in the chat room, our good mate Terence, who actually, despite calling in, I think B-Man, you asked what his win percentage when he calls in is. Well, he's lost that after last week's call. He's just wondering whether 3 talls is the way forward. I think we've discussed that ad nauseum on this podcast. They even tried it out against Carlton, and it didn't seem to work in terms of output for the day, despite us winning. George, are we going to try 3 talls again?
I think, unfortunately, the Wiedemann experiment means that for that interval, we can't judge whether the 3 talls has worked or not. We're going to have to go and experiment again from scratch from our next game. I don't think when Jackson goes down there, he plays as a traditional type of tall, but it certainly doesn't help. It certainly helps other sides. You do need the height. You can't have a single tall forward down there. And the way that the 2 forwards interact, particularly the 2 talls, as the 2 permanent type of talls, the way they interact is really critical. So once again, I think the Wiedemann experiments put us back 5 or 6 weeks. It failed. It's an experiment. You got to try sometimes. You got to try different options. But probably the next 6 weeks, with let's assume Ben Brown's in there, will tell us what we want to go into the finals period with.
Yeah, but I think the Sam Wiedemann experiment's a good name for a band, but not so good for a forward line setup. And just on that, it's not entirely clear to me that we have played three talls, given his output in the last 3-4 weeks. So it's, it's not much of a test if one of your talls isn't taking any marks and barely contesting. I think, as you say, George, the key will be Brown coming in, and I think they're definitely, that's where they're wanting to go. I think three talls in terms of what it means for bringing the ball to ground. And the other thing that is interesting about Brown is he's everything that Wiedemann's not in terms of being a natural forward. He's all about his leading patterns. So hopefully he's fit and ready to go. And it's been a real problem, though, hasn't it, not having the VFL games to run some of these players into touch. It'll be interesting to see if he does line up against the Bombers. I hope he does.
Apologies accepted to Terence as well. He's in the chat room.
Well, you're talking three talls. Are you including Fritsch as that tall, or are you including the resting Gawn/Jackson in the three with currently Weed and T-Mac? Because I think their preferred model is, I would have thought, let's say it's Brown. It's Brown, Fritsch, Jackson and T-Mac. Mm.
And, in that model, as I've said before, Jackson's really a high half forward. Fritsch is a medium tall who needs to have a tall defender on him. I think that's their ideal lineup, and it's as much structural as it is anything else. And, I mean, that's, with Sam Wiedemann, if he's bringing the ball to ground and, not doing much other than that, that's enough from a structural perspective. But as George pointed out, he wasn't doing that. And, he's Moore schooled him a few times, didn't he? Like, where he just he doesn't seem to sort of get himself in a position to disrupt the pack, and Moore just outread him a number of times. And that Brown will at least bring it to ground, I think. So I think that's their structure that they're keen on. But I think that, I think the point Terence is probably making is that we were, at our most effective forward line in terms of, how sharp we looked in those first 4 or 5 weeks with just Fritter, T-Mac and Jackson.
So why can't we get up for games against these bottom sides? Our best performances this year have clearly been against the top sides. We're 5-0 against top 8 teams, yet we've lost 2 games to 2 teams in the bottom 4. Well, they were in the bottom 4 when we played them. And our next worst games that we managed to still win were against North and Hawthorn. And I get the argument that we're 11-2. However, we were 9-0. And then had a month ahead that consisted of 2 bottom 4 teams and 2 top 3 teams. We knocked off the 2 top 2 teams, but we were outclassed and arguably outcoached by the bottom 4 teams. And sure, it's upsetting, but even taking emotion out of it, I'm actually more concerned about those 2 losses than I am heartened by the 2 great wins that we had. What do we make out of that? I mean, we've come out 2-2 from those games, but to me it's upsetting. I think, Big Man, you're not as upset as I am going into this break.
Well, I mean, look, I just think it goes to what we're asking our players in the game, in the way they play. Now, we've talked a lot about it, but our game plan is pretty very similar to Richmond's. We've got some differences, some key differences, but we've got some key similarities, and one of which is that contest is number 1. That's the fundamental. You win the contest ball. Territory, number 2. All-team defensive running, number 3. They're the things that both Melbourne and Richmond share. And Richmond, every year they've won a premiership, have struggled in matches where you'd think they won't, because the way we both teams play is extremely hard psychologically and physically to go through a full season to do that, because you just can't do it. You have to be fully switched on, fully invested in the running. Someone like Langdon runs 15, 16, 17 kilometres in a game of footy. So someone like Brayshaw has to do that. And, your nibblers and your A&Bs and your forwards, and they have to do serious kilometres. They could all feel like they put in, but only be off 5%, and we're not there. I just think that it's a factor of the way we play. So those, why the lower teams, psychologically, it's harder to come up, I think, for those games, to get aroused to do that. And if you asked each one coming in, if you did a test, do you think you're ready for this game? Are you going to play it? They'd all say yes, but the proof's in the pudding. And I think that all teams struggle. Like, the same question could be asked about, well, how could Swans lose that game to Hawthorn? I watched that game and they were similarly flat as us, and it looked like they were going to lose that game right the way through. It just happens. I think they're not much younger than us, so we're a team full of we're about a third of our players are under 23 or something. It's a hard game plan to sustain, much easier if the West Coast or Geelong that can just hold the ball for big parts of the match. Much less physically demanding, much less psychologically demanding as well. We need to be fully switched on and intense every time we play to play our best. And I think it's hard to come up against those lower teams and to be in that mental state.
I think the other factor is that you're actually playing a bottom side or a top side. When you play a Richmond, they bring the physical pressure to you. That's the way they play, and that will cause you to respond likewise. When that physical pressure doesn't come, like it did in this game, it's hard for players to actually get up. So it's a different sort of a perverse sort of outcome of playing a bottom side, that you drop off naturally because you don't have to put up your defences as strongly as you do. So I think there's that factor. The other thing that it's very easy to forget is how close this competition is. On the weekend, we saw a team that played in the grand final 18 months ago in GWS be taken right to the line by the 18th team in the competition in North Melbourne, and they drew. Same reason again, you just can't perform as well as you are capable of doing it when your opposition's pretty awful to come up against. And if you're not scoring and you don't get far enough ahead in these games, there's plenty of coaches just adopt the attitude, let's stay as close as possible and we'll try and snaffle it in the end. If you don't open the lead against a team that's employing those tactics, that's exactly what will happen, because you're already turned off. You're not at your 100%. You're only playing at 80% or 90%. And these days you can't afford to give the opposition those chances within the game. So it's not surprising. And you look at the West Coast Richmond game, a fantastic game, pressure game. Skills were high, and then you go to another game like the Hawthorn Sydney game or the North and GWS games. The skill presentation was just awful. It was awful to watch as a game compared to that. So the good teams bring the pressure and they feed off each other. When you're playing a lower side, don't expect to be playing at the same levels.
Yeah, and also there's a real risk to look at everything through through the lens of Melbourne, because it's not unique. I mean, Cats got beaten by Adelaide Crows. The first game of the season, they got knocked off by a couple of goals. The Crows scored 103 points against them in that game. So, 15-13 they scored. They got on top of them, and, the Crows are down near the bottom and the Cats are one of the premiership favourites. It just happens. It's a simple, it just happens. It will continue to happen. It's always happened. I mean, for years, following Melbourne for 40 years, the 45 years is that many of those years I lived for the games where the D's knocked off one of the top teams. That's what we did. So those teams become the hunter for the day, and if the hunted team is, a little bit off, then they'll get rolled. It's always happened in footy, and it will continue happening in footy. Each of the premiership, the only team that hasn't really lost one to a lower team so far is the Dogs. And we'll see, but they will at some point. A bottom 8 team will roll the Dogs at some point, and people will ask questions about them. It's just footy.
So our run home, we've got 9 after the bye. We've got 9 games. If you have a look at the teams and where they're situated on the ladder, we've got 5 against bottom 8 sides and 4 against top 8 sides. You can maybe switch GWS around as well and say 4 against bottom 8, 5 against top 8. How do you see us, George, going into this run home?
With the teams that we're playing, we still should finish in top two, and that's because currently we sit with 11 wins, and we've got to play Essendon, GWS, both at the MCG, the Hawks at the MCG, the Crows at the MCG, and the Suns up in Gold Coast. So you'd think of all of those games and the location that we've got a reasonably good chance. Let's hope that we are playing at the MCG is one of the other considerations. We might be playing the whole lot at Metricon. We've got four games against Port Adelaide, the Dogs, West Coast and the Cats. And unfortunately, 3 of those games are away. So it's going to be a really hard slog against those teams. But if we assume, and after this game, this weekend, I don't know that you can assume all that much, that we can pull off 5 of those 5 easier type of games or games against the bottom 8 sides, which we should beat, then we're in a really serious position to finish in the top 2, meaning that we only have to win one of those remaining 4 games. And we do play the Dogs at the MCG in one of those games as well. So our run home, apart from those travel situations, is quite reasonable. We're at the top of the ladder still. We're there because we're a good side. If we start dropping games against these bottom 8 sides leading into the second half of the season, then we don't deserve to be there in any case. But this is our big opportunity to prove that we are worthy of that position. So let's go and show them.
Big man.
Yeah. Look, I think that really we're in a box seat to finish top 2, and arguably if we don't finish top 2 from here, then we're not the team we think we are at this stage. So I think that the bye has come at a good time. I thought that was a really interesting comment from Goody. We're in a lot's gone right for us this year. We've had a fair bit of luck, I reckon. Even this period here was, in terms of the COVID, hasn't hit us as hard as it has other teams. I think we've had to travel for this game, but we were travelling last week anyway, so that's taken out of the equation a little bit. We came home, so it's not as if we've had to do what Richmond have done and been in a harbour way. And the other thing is we're pretty well positioned. It has to be said for injuries, and injuries is really the biggest sort of indicator of success. So, I think that, as George says, we're in a good shape to finish top 2, which will be important. It may not, be interesting to see what happens to the ladder. It may not even matter in terms of a interstate trip. It depends a bit whether, where the Lions end up, where they end up. You think that, they'll probably finish top 4, so it could well come down to that. But it's likely to be 3 Victorian clubs in that top 4 potentially. I can't see Port or Richmond getting up there into the top 4. So top 2 will be super important because you win that first week, you don't have to travel out of the state. So we should from here. My confidence is not dented from that loss. But I'm hoping that they seem to be pretty mature at the moment. They take this time. We're in a good shape with injuries. We'll have Viney back. We'll have Brown up to full fitness. I think that we're set up pretty well. But it makes this next game really important, doesn't it? So, we really need to get a win against Essendon back home at the G, all things being equal. Hopefully that's the case. Because they're a dangerous team. The way they move the ball or the way that other teams are going to like to move it against us. They like to move it fast, but they also play a pretty contested brand. They've got a very similar philosophy to Richmond and Melbourne, and you can see where they've built their game plan around, but they move it faster than we do. They play on faster. So at the G, if we're off a little bit, they'll cut us up for sure. I think they're a pretty good team, actually, Essendon. So that I think it will be a really important game for us.
Well, let's talk about the Essendon game, and we might start with changes. I guess the first one depends on whether Viney is fit. I guess it depends as well whether there's a reserves competition where he might need match fitness. Does Viney come straight back into the team, George?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. If he's ready to go, he'll be back in. As Binman has said a couple of times, we miss his hardness around the ball. Our other mids in particular play the ball, but Viney plays the man as well, much better than they do. So it brings that pressure suddenly back into the midfield that we so desperately need. I think I'll go on what Goodwin said even in his conference after the game, where he was very positive about Viney returning. It's a decent break that we've still got. It's another 2 weeks basically. So also we've got Nathan Jones sitting in the side, waiting, obviously ready to come back in. That was mentioned by Goodwin as well. Aaron Vandenberg was another one that was mentioned.
So was Melksham.
So was Melksham, yeah, unfortunately.
Well, we did very well with Melksham in the side.
That might have been the real factor.
Well, we'll wait and see about that one, but certainly there's needs that we've currently got that could be filled by these the older now, tougher, harder type of mids. We need to bring something else into the midfield that's been missing in these couple of games. And as Binman said, we've got a whole stack of younger players who are just looking flat at the moment. Could probably do with, they're going to get 2 weeks off, although they'll be still training. But maybe it's the time that we looked at whether Cozzy needs a break for an additional week, whether Spargo needs a break for an additional week. Sparrow's certainly. Although he hasn't played much, he didn't perform particularly well. So this is the opportunity to give someone a run. I mean, when are you going to give them a run if you don't give it to them in this next couple of weeks? You don't want to be chopping and changing if you're a finals contender in the last month or so. So I think we'll see a few changes coming in post-bye.
Yes. Anything else, boys?
Well, who do you think will come in, Andy?
Look, I think we've got to bring Viney in as soon as he's ready, and I would like Ben Brown to come in. Look, we've got a pretty big break now. I don't know who needs a rest or whether they are going to do that. I guess a lot of it depends on whether the twos are playing. I just don't know. I think that's where I'm sitting at the moment.
Binman, what's your thoughts?
I think Ben Brown will come in, and I reckon that I won't be shocked if Melksham comes back in. I think that they want Melksham in that side. He had to get dropped last week. I can't believe I'm saying it, but they, I think they like him in the side for his ability to change the direction of the game, but he needs to bring the intensity. So I'm not sure what the go is there with his mindset, but I suspect they see him in their team in the finals. So, I think that I won't be shocked if he comes back in, actually. Viney straight back in, because he's shown he's been able to do that before, to come back in, and we really miss him around the midfield. I think it's one of the interesting things about being 11-2 is that I'm guilty of underestimating Viney, I think, and I would not, in previous seasons, and his importance to the team. And because we've won, and it's easy to forget his influence. I think he's been a big out, and bringing him back in, it's what we talked a bit last week. It's not just him coming back in, but it means that then Jordan can go back to the halfback flank role or wing that, plays 50-60%. He becomes a more damaging player in a way, Jordan, because he's 21 or something. We don't want him being smashed in the midfield. That's not who we want come finals. We want him as an outside player who makes good decisions, and then that allows other players to move around. I wouldn't be shocked if they'll also be looking to get Jones back in, to get some grunt around the around the midfield in different positions, because he's a seasoned player. If you think as much as Captain Jack, he was good last week, not so good this week. In that game, it would have been interesting to have someone like Jones, physical and his experience. It might have made a difference in terms of the overall sort of the way we approach that game. And maybe we need that a bit of the senior player and leadership in the team. So it's interesting to see whether he might come back in as well.
Well, lots to think about. I must say, nothing that you guys have said today has made me feel any better.
Good thing that there's a bye, Andy, because you're going to watch. Maybe if I prescribe you to watch the Richmond game, at the Dogs game, and the Lions game between now and the Bombers game. As you know, and if that doesn't work, just watch the last quarter of selection of 4 or 5 other games.
Yeah, I'll try and do that. George, you had sent me some audio clips during the week. Is there anything you want me to play out of those before
No, those are to be saved up for next week. We're going to do the review, but there was a couple of audio clips from various coaches to give some insights about what we were doing from the coaching aspects, and I think we'll save them up for next week.
Well, that's a good plug, a segue into what we're going to do next week in the bye week. We're planning. B-Man, do you want to plug it? You probably can explain it better than I can.
Yeah, well, so Andy, I'm really hoping that you'll be up and about next week because we've got our mid-season review, and we need the captain in form. So
my funk will only last a week. We're only a day out.
All right. Well, we better make it from next Tuesday. Will you be right by then?
I should be right by tomorrow, but
right.
Usually takes.
Next week
hours.
we'll do a bit of a mid-season review, and we'll look at sort of the coaching structure, talk about what the identifiable Melbourne brand, what is it in a few words, tactics, game plan, and all that jazz. We'll have a discussion on that. We jumped ahead, but Andy will do his famous ladder prediction and see where we'll finish. We'll do a positive one and optimistic and conservative one.
I'll just butt in. I was actually, while you guys were talking before, I sort of was doing a quick one on the fly, I'll save the results for next week.
For next week. Good. And,
I'll do a positive one and a sort of a negative one to see where we're likely to. The tricky thing is it's not so hard to do our games because you can do the positive and negative but a lot of those teams around us, they all play each other, so it'll differ. The ladder will look a lot different depending on who wins those ones. A lot of them are 50-50 ones. I didn't know who to pick, so that'll be interesting too. It's not just our games, but all those teams, the Bulldogs, Geelong, West Coast, Brisbane, Sydney, they all play each other. So that's gonna have an effect on
maybe we could do like a multiverse, the universe, sort of different timelines for.
Well, what did Doctor Strange say in that Avengers movie, that there were 16 million possible outcomes and we only succeeded in one.
And we'll have a review of the other teams that we think are in the sort of line, so that might help in that discussion around the clubs competing for the top 4. Might do a sort of a bit of look at the players in a top 5 who would be top 5 in the Bluey at the moment, and our highlights of the year. So people want to call in next week and any of those topics, that would be great.
It's going to be interesting. The next 3 weeks with the top sort of 4 or 5 teams in the competition. That Geelong play Western Bulldogs, Port play Sydney, West Coast play the Western Bulldogs, Brisbane play Geelong, and Sydney play West Coast as well. So we should have a little bit of an inkling next week about what's happening just below us on the ladder, but also we might also get an inkling about who's going to be a serious challenger to us come the end of the year.
Yeah, there's some cracking games coming up in the next few weeks, actually, from that perspective.
And it'd be nice if a few bottom four teams could knock off a few top four teams, like we've seen have done to us.
Well, as something to cheer you up, Andy, on the game, who was it? There were a couple of games on the weekend. I think one was the Richmond game, and the West Coast. I enjoyed watching Richmond lose anyway.
But how ropeable would you have been with that? Was that kick 15 metres?
No, absolutely not. Those mower strips are, I think, 9.5 or 10 metres wide, and it was kicked inside one of those mower strips to even further inside one of the mower strips. It wasn't even 10 metres.
Geez, it was a good kick, though.
Yeah, it was a great kick.
Beautiful kick.
A terrific kick. So, but this is how well we're travelling, because in previous years there'd be any number of games that you'd go, oh, God, come on, we want them to both lose or win, or a draw is good, or, because it's going to make a difference for us making the 8. There's fewer games that really have any bearing on where we're going to finish or who we're going to play in the first week. So,
well, there is
finals.
There is a good game next week, Friday night. That's Bulldogs, Geelong. They're two teams, obviously, that are
the Cattery too.
Yeah, so they're two teams that are vying for our position and or thereabouts. Who do we want? I think there's a thread on Demonland. I haven't really dived into it about who we would prefer to win. So I'll put that out to you. Who do you want to win, Bimman, out of that game?
Out of that game, I hate the Cats.
I know, but if we take emotion out of it in terms of our position.
Well, I mean, we don't want to bury the lead for next week, but who would we prefer? I'd much prefer to play the Cats than Bulldogs. Bulldogs are a more, I think, a much bigger chance of winning the flag than the Cats, but it might be my hatred for the Cats.
George?
No, I think the same way. I think Geelong will get exposed once you get to final stage where they're not playing down at the Cattery with all the advantages that they get out of that ground and the crowd. The Bulldogs are far, far more dangerous, and I think once again, as we've seen for the last 3 years at least, the Geelong's legs just don't last the distance. They've got great players still in the side, but all of a sudden you're starting to see players who aren't up to the previous standards being put into their side. The fact that they recruited, again, more over 30s in their side means that these are the last rolls of the dice. But I think the Bulldogs are far, far more threatening across the whole ground than what Geelong are.
Yeah. Oh, Geelong's... And a funny thing about the game, which was a pretty good game of footy to watch, I must say, the Cats Port Adelaide game. But and as much as people pumped up the Cats' tyres for winning that game, I actually thought it was a knock on both clubs. It was both nearly 100 points given up. They were hopeless. Both teams were hopeless defensively. They could not stop the transition from the half-back flank. They couldn't stop each other. Geelong had 25 contested marks or something ridiculous, which means that there was no pressure from Port Adelaide on the kick inside 50, and no decent tall backs to bring the ball to ground. I actually thought that it was a funny game to watch because whilst it was enjoyable enough to watch as a game of footy, for me it reinforced that Port Adelaide are miles off it, and I wasn't particularly, it was impressive that the Cats got back and won that game. But those sorts of games where it bounces back and forth between the arcs and high scoring aren't the sort of template for winning flags in the last decade. Richmond style of squashing and strangling teams is what wins flags, not open flowing games of footy where it's 95 to 100.
I'm still a bit worried about Geelong's forward line. That worries me. We didn't come up against their full strength forward line.
I think the answer to Geelong is actually quite easy. You stop the ball getting in there in the first place, and that's what Port Adelaide didn't do in this game. It was just Hawkins and Cameron just had free rein inside the forward 50 with the the way the ball was coming in. You've got to stop it coming in the first place.
Exactly. You've got to put that kick inside 50 under pressure, and you've got to have a system that allows someone to come across Hawkins and make it a 2-on-1 and either intercept mark or bring it to ground. I couldn't believe the amount of space that they gave Hawkins. You don't leave Hawkins one out. That's bloody mid-90s style footy.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was not only he wasn't the only one taking completely uncontested marks inside the 50. Rowan had a couple as well. But yeah, you just got to put the pressure on them, and they're not what they used to be. They were missing Cam Guthrie in that game, but Selwood's not what he used to be by any stretch, and they're really running out of options in the middle to start moving the ball. But Hinkley was just awful the way that he just didn't respond. Yeah,
it was a bit like the way Carlton are playing. They're trying to win on a shootout.
Yeah.
It's just There was a funny moment, and just one final thing, Andy. What's his name? Tim Watson's son. What's his name?
Joe Watson.
Watson Jr. has inherited all ex-footballers' inability to come into the game and be special comments person, because in that game he was saying that Port Adelaide, like to hold it and move it slowly and deliberately. He said that at the beginning, and I was like, of course they don't. What are you talking about? And then by the end of the first quarter, after them pinging around saying, well, look, they've decided to play fast. But then the Dogs game he was commentating, and he said that, he was pumping up how good the Dogs are at kicking the ball. He said there's only one team better, Melbourne. It's like, what? Well, I want some of what he's having, and maybe he's in a different timeline as well, because in my multiverse, the Demons are a long way off the best kicking side in the league, that's for sure.
Absolutely. All right, boys, I think we're going to leave it there. That's a nice and short one today. Mirroring exactly how I'm feeling. All right, we'll be back. We'll be back next week with a special mid-season review of this. Barring this week, a fantastic season to date. As I said at the top of the show, if you would have told us we'd be 11-2 midway, none of us would have believed that. And it's fantastic we're there, and we'll talk about why we're there next week. So let's go Demons.
Let's go Red Legs. And Andy, just remember, we're not going to lose a game of footy this weekend.
We're not going to win one either, so come
Where's
on.
The doctor? Bring the doctor in.
I've been so spoiled this year. There's no coming back. Only a premiership will solve this. All right, guys, we'll be back next week. Go Demons.
Go Demons.